Today we are going to have an outward focus to this message. So this message is not about us, it's more to do with how we respond to those around us. You see, we live in a world that is becoming increasingly more divided and more extreme in a whole variety of ways. The political lines are more polarised than ever, with increasingly stronger views being expressed on all sides. I'm not going to make this into a political talk, but we need to be aware and we need to observe and be wise about what's going on around us. What are these times telling us? The weather is becoming stranger. I think it is anyway. And now we have this global pandemic. And this global disease is causing a further increase in the divisions that there are in humanity, and it is revealing just kind of how awful as humans we are and can be to one another, and also how we can be so inconsiderate towards the environment that we live in. And obviously, conversely, there's some amazing acts of kindness going on as well, and some fantastic support networks that have been set up. But relative to the destruction and the chaos, there's actually a significant increase in selfishness. And we're currently experiencing that in our nation and in the wider world. But who is it that bears the brunt of it all? Who is it that really suffers? Well, at the beginning of Galatians 2, Paul writes about his acceptance by the apostles of his work spreading the gospel amongst the Gentiles. That's the non-Jews. That's me, and maybe you as well. In all of this, there was only one thing that he was specifically asked to do by those he was visiting. That's in Galatians 2 verse 10, and it's this. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. Remember the poor. So today, let's do that. Let's remember the poor. But that's quite a generic term, isn't it? Who are the poor? Well, for the sake of today's message, we could talk a lot about this. It's quite a big subject, but for the sake of today's message, we're going to look at the Old Testament and consider what the Hebrew meaning of poor is. And it means, well, poor, oppressed, and afflicted. And in the Jewish law, there are 19 specific laws referring to how to treat the poor, ranging from leaving food for them so they can, glean the grapes in the vineyard or the corn from the fields, to what they must bring to the sacrifice if they can't afford the normal offering. There's still an expectation on the poor, but they didn't have to bring the same kind of thing as the rich. And if you read through these laws, which I did, you kind of get an idea of what it means to be poor in that society. So someone who is poor is someone who can't easily access or afford food, someone who finds it difficult to get justice, someone who is oppressed by others, and that can be bullied by neighbours, government or others, etc., enslaved even, and someone who has ongoing suffering. So that's usually physical, but it also can be obviously mental health as well. And also someone who has a limited means to support themselves, like a widow or an orphan, and also an outsider known as an alien or a foreigner fits into this category of being poor as well. And you see, that's that culture. That's then. That's what was considered to be poor in those times. But if we bear that in mind and then bring that into today, You see, in our culture, these people are becoming increasingly sidelined, and yet our call is to remember them. But it's not just about like going, oh yeah, the poor. It's actually keeping them in our mind, keeping them in our thinking, them being present in how we go about our day and what comes to mind during our day. And this is all made a lot more difficult when we're struggling, and therefore it's no surprise that the suffering of the poor has increased by a very very big margin during this pandemic. Listen to these. These are 4 different verses from Proverbs. Proverbs 14 verse 31 says, "Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honours God." Proverbs 19 and verse 17, "Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done." Proverbs 21 and verse 13, "Whoever shuts their ears to the cry of the poor will also cry out and not be answered." And then Proverbs 22 and verse 9, "The generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor." And these proverbs are worth reflecting on in terms of how we react to need and respond to those asking for help. But it's easy to think of this as giving money for food, isn't it? So let's have another look at these verses. Again, Proverbs 14 verse 31. It says, "Whoever is kind to the needy." Proverbs 19 verse 17. "Whoever is kind to the poor." You see, this word kind, again in the Hebrew, is about showing favour and being gracious. And you see, it's really easy to show favour to someone who shows favour to you. It's really easy to be gracious to, let's say, a rich person. Is it? But this is about showing favour and grace to someone in a whole variety of need. It's that rather than dishing out your spare change. You see, it requires more of us than a distanced giving, but demands an engaged personal response. Why? Because that is how God responds to us. You see, he hears our cry and responds. He becomes engaged with our plight and responds personally to our need. He's our example in this. So let's look at the other 2 proverbs. Proverbs 21:13. "Whoever shuts their ears to the cry of the poor." Again, it's not about giving. Although, obviously they could be asking for stuff, but they could also be asking for justice, couldn't they? You see, this cry here, it's a cry of distress, a cry for help, and it's a cry that we should not ignore. Proverbs 22 and verse 9 is an interesting one. When I looked this one up, I don't know why it's translated as it is, because it literally means, "He who has a generous eye is blessed for giving his bread to the poor," which is quite different from what I read earlier. But this is about looking for opportunities to be generous. It's about actively seeking how we can share with those in need. You see, this bread could be literal in terms of sharing daily food with them, or it could mean sharing our lives, sharing God's provision with them, that as in that which God has given us to give out to who? The poor. So these are just a few verses from one book in the Old Testament about God's heart and maybe our heart for the poor. And how do we respond? Well, I think to start with, like Paul wrote, remember the poor, be mindful of them, remember them. Have these people in your head, in your prayer life. And then from that foundation, seek God. Ask him what we should do, how we can be kind. What does it say in his word to how we should respond? Even just those few verses I read. And there are many verses about God's view of the poor and how we should be. Have a look. I might actually do a part 2 of this. And the thing is, when we are generous, God is honoured in that. Are we not children who should honour our Heavenly Father? And then, of course, there's Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46. I'm not going to read through that now, but have a read yourselves in this context. Matthew 25, 31 to 46. Consider that passage in light of these verses from Proverbs. And on Sunday, we had this song called God of Justice by Tim Hughes, and it was the last song in the service. But you know what? I'm going to play it again today. It's going to follow on from this talk today if you let it continue rather than, I don't want to hear that again. Well, the lyrics are quite strong even, and it's a call for us to go and feed the hungry, to not just think about our religiousness, our holy ways, but actually engage with those in need around us, like God engages with us. So I hope this has been something to provoke you a little bit, and my aim is possibly to do a follow-up either in the next few days or next week, because God has a lot to say about this in his word. Bye for now.